Hello everyone. Mm, welcome to the lecture IMT 4129. Uh, First of all, I'd like to apologize for not sending you the recording files in time. I was facing some technical challenges with the screen recorder, so that's why I managed to finish my recording just now, and hence I am uploading it. So yeah, the recording is based on the lecture that I provided you on 25th of January on Thursday, and it's about ISO 27005 risk management standard. So we are going to talk about ISO 27005 risk management standard, and we'll also see each and every steps involved in this framework. The idea of this lecture is to discuss that what are the significance of ISO 27005 risk management standard and how you can implement this framework in your project. Okay, so ISO stands for International Organization for Standardization, and we often write it as ISO/IEC 27005, and IEC stands for International Electrotechnical Commission. So this framework was prepared by the Joint Technical Committee, ISO, IEC, JTC1, and they are responsible for writing or creating many international standard all over the world. The first edition of ISO 27005 was released in 2008, and the second version is released in 2011. So in this lecture and in this course, we are going to deal with the ISO 27005 version 2011. Okay, so if you are going to read about the concept of related to this framework and everything, then I'll recommend you to go for 2011 version, because the terms you will find some changes in the terms between 2008 and 2011, right? So it's a good idea that you follow the same version that I'm going to tell you now. That is 2011. Okay, so here I'm going to present you a picture of many such standards available, and you can see that on the top that is 27,000 ISO 27,000 standard is available. So in this picture you can see that there are four broad categories of standard that we are aware of. The first one is the terminology. Second one is general requirements. The third one is general guidelines, and the fourth is sector specific guidelines. So it means that the first one, 27,000 standard, deals with the overview and vocabulary. It also provides the background terms and definition applicable to information security, risk management, information security family of standards, right? And the second one, general requirement, and here comes the two well-known standards, 27,001 and 27,006. In this picture we can find ISO 27005 in the third category, general guidelines, risk management. So it means that it provides the general guideline to conduct risk management in your organization. So it also signifies that you can use any approach that you want in conducting the risk management. But this ISO 27005 will give you a very nice idea, and it will provide you the structure of carrying out risk management task in your organization. The it's The scope of ISO 27005 risk management standard. It provides the guidelines for information security risk management. So as I just said, that it's a guideline, and it's more about helping you with setting up all the processes, and how you can define your task throughout the risk management process. And it also builds on the idea of ISO 27001 and 27002. and it is applicable to all organization. It doesn't matter that if you have small size, mid size, large enterprise, you can apply the concept of ISO 27005 in any organization, and it is relevant to the managers, staff, and all the entities, all the parties who are concerned with information security risk management. It is also important that we have the clear idea about the terms and the concepts used throughout this standard, and you can see that there are different terms that sound very close to each other. For example, risk analysis, risk assessment, um, risk evaluation, risk identification, and those those are like very relatable terms, and people often use it interchangeably, but there is a slight difference, I can say, or there is a difference among the concept of these terms. So um, I will also recommend you to go through this slide, and understand different terms, concepts used throughout the standard, and besides all the terms that are written in this slide, the current definitions from ISO 27000 also applies. So if you want if you want to get the knowledge of other terms and other concepts that are discussed in this standard, I will recommend you to also go through ISO 27000 standard. So what is information security risk management? So whenever we deal with information security risk management, we often come across the terms like asset, vulnerability, threat, impact, control, risk, right? And so that's why it's very important that we have the clear understanding of these terms that are involved and that play a major role in information security risk management. I will try to explain the concept in a very simple manner. That's why I have a very simple diagram here. You can see that there is a man standing on a rope here, and the rope is passing on a water body, and water body also contains some crocodile, right? So you can imagine this man as an asset. It means that this man can be an employee in your company, and this man can possess some important knowledge, information that is very critical for your organization. Okay, so it's and it's also important that you protect your asset. I mean, you protect your employee, because the information possessed by him is very valuable. But this and the task of this asset, the task of this man is to cross on this rope without falling into the water. But we can assume that this man has some weakness, some some vulnerability in terms of not able to maintain the balance on the rope while crossing this river, and that will create a risk that the man can fall in this water body. And similarly, we have some crocodile in the water that is acting as a threat, and threat is something that can exploit the vulnerability of the system of the asset. So here in this scenario, the crocodile can injure this man, and in the worst scenario, the crocodile can kill this man here, right? So the impact, I mean, if there's any case where the man falls into this river and the crocodile kill this man, then there will be a bad impact that and the risk will be that you will lose this man, you will lose your employee here in this scenario. Okay, so the information security risk management deals with understanding that how valuable is the asset for you, and finding out the vulnerabilities so that you can protect your asset from the potential threat, by understanding the impact any security incident or any incident that can create on this asset. So this is what we are going to discuss right now. In this scenario, we are going to protect the man as an asset, but in reality, you can have many different asset that comes with many different vulnerabilities, and similarly the the threat, the types of threat will be different, and the risk it can generate will also be different. But the whole idea is that you have to protect your asset, and you have to, that's why it's important that you know about the vulnerability and threat and everything in a very, in a proper way. Okay, so what is the background? I mean, what are the things that are necessary in ISO 27005? So we have to first of all establish the external and internal context, and context means that you have to set up everything in that phase. You have to define that what so it's basically like a planning phase where you are going to have all the inform necessary, you have to gather the necessary information from the relevant people of your organization, and you have to define the scope and everything that you are going to uh, carry out the risk management task. And you have to assess the potential risk and treat the risk using a risk treatment plan. We are also going to learn very shortly that how we can assess the risk and treat it with a risk treatment plan. And risk management analyzes what can happen and the possible consequences, along with the possible likelihood of occurring any incident. And so it's more like before deciding what should be done and when, it's important that you have the clear idea that what can happen and the possible consequence of happening. And risk management must be an integral part of information security. So you cannot think of you cannot think that an organization can sustain properly without having the risk management task involved in it. And risk management can be applied to any organization as a whole, or to any other smaller system also. You can also apply it in a small team. Typically, information security risk management should perform the following tasks: that it should identify risk, it should assess risk in terms of consequence and likelihood, it should communicate risk properly to all the involved stakeholders in your company. It should also establish the priority order for risk treatment, so that you know that what are the most important risk whom you should treat first. And it should establish priority order for actions to reduce the risk. And it should keep all the involved stakeholders informed about the risk management process, the task, the outcome of each and every phase. And it's important that it should educate managers and staffs about risk and actions to mitigate them. Okay, this is also one of the most important ideas of conducting risk management task. Okay, so here you can see this framework of ISO 27005, and you can see that there are many arrows, many arrows are present here, and you can see that there are several boxes are available. And so the first thing that we conduct in ISO 27005 is to establish a context. After once it is established, we conduct this risk assessment phase that consists of identification, analysis, and evaluation. If you are happy, if you are satisfied with the outcome of risk assessment phase, then only you will go for the risk treatment phase. Otherwise, if you are not satisfied, then you have to again go back to the context establishment. It means that if you are not satisfied, it signifies that there was something missing in the context establishment phase, or maybe the risk assessment phase. So that's why we should redo it. Okay, so if you are satisfied, then you go for the risk treatment. And if you are satisfied with the outcome of risk treatment phase, then you go for the risk acceptance. Otherwise, we'll again have to go back to the context establishment similarly. And at all point of time, it's important that you communicate the risk and all the information with the with the relevant stakeholder, and you should update them that what's happening, so that they have the updated idea or information about everything. Okay, we can also see that the whole ISO 27005 framework relies on the idea of PDCA cycle. PDCA means plan, do, check, act. It means that in ISO 27005 approach, we start with the planning. Once we have a solid planning, we know that okay, the plan is going to work properly according to our assessment. Then we do something, we implement, the we implement, and after that we check that if everything is going fine and according to our expectation, and finally we act based on the output of the check phase. And this goes on in a cyclic manner. It means that we always plan, we do something, we check, and we act, and we again plan, do, check, act. So that's why it's called PDCA cycle. So if you also conduct risk management in your organization using the idea of ISO 27005, then you must follow the same cycle of PDCA to get the most efficient outcome. Right, now we can see that we also have this diagram in front of us, and as I told you in this diagram of ISO 27005 framework, that it consists of many phases and there are many arrow and everything, but I personally feel that it's not very easy to understand that what's happening in each and every phase. For example, what's happening inside context establishment, what's happening inside risk analysis, and that's why I was thinking that maybe if we have a more elaborate illustration of the framework, then it will help us more to understand it or to apply it to our project, right? And that's why I have this diagram where you can see that the activity from the previous framework is defined here in the middle, and in the left hand side we have some input, and at the right hand side we have output. It means that at the left hand side I mentioned all the important information that we need as an input to carry out this activity, and once we conduct this activity, we are going to produce these many things as an output. And it's also very interesting to see that the outcome of the first phase, the context establishment phase, will act as an input for the second phase, right? So having this picture will allow you to have a clear idea about all the relevant information, critical information that you need throughout your risk management task. And in this way you can quickly check that whether or not you have the availability of the information required to carry out a particular activity. So this phase, the left hand side, and that is input, is marked as I, with letter I. The activity is marked with letter A, and the final, I mean the right hand side output is marked with letter O. If you want to read more about this framework and understand more about the application, you can also download this paper, and which is written by me, and you can also see that how we can deal with each and every information that we mentioned here. But this is an optional recommendation, and you should do this only if you have enough time and if you are interested to learn more about it. Okay, so ISO 27005 standard provides guidelines for information security risk management. This one consists of context establishment, which includes determining the objective of the organization, specifying the basic criteria, that is setting risk evaluation criteria, impact criteria, and risk acceptance criteria. And it also outlines the scope and boundaries of information security risk management. The risk assessment phase consists of risk analysis, risk identification, and risk evaluation. In the risk identification step, the assets and their owners are identified. It is followed by the identification of the threats to those identified assets, the existing and planned control, the vulnerabilities that might be exploited, and a record of incident scenarios with their impact related to those identified assets. Risk analysis step takes either qualitative or quantitative approach to assessing the consequence and the likelihood of occurrence of relevant incidents. In the risk evaluation step, the identified risks are prioritized according to the risk evaluation criteria about the incident scenario that lead to those risks. If the result of risk assessment step is satisfactory, then the risk treatment options are selected. Here, risk treatment options are selected based on the outcome of risk assessment, the expected cost of implementing these options, and the expected benefits from these options are always considered while choosing the risk treatment options. The risks are retained, which is also known as which is also known as the residual risk. The risks are retained when the level of risk satisfies the risk acceptance criteria. Risk communication and consultation step ensures exchange, sharing of information between the decision maker and other stakeholders throughout the risk management process. Similarly, risk and their factors, that is the value of assets, impact, threats, vulnerabilities, and the likelihood of occurrence, should be monitored and reviewed to identify and changes in the content to the organization at an early stage, right? So this is how we just discussed that what are the significance of each and every activity involved in ISO 27005 framework. And now we are going to see each and every activity in a more detailed way. So the first activity is the context establishment, and we have something as an input. Here we require these things as an input to carry out this activity, and we expect that we should generate these many things as an output from this activity. So the context establishment phase, it basically sets the basic criteria. It defines scope and boundaries, and it also establishes an organization for information security risk management. As an input, we need mainly two types of information here. The first one is the report from prior risk assessment. That is, I told you that information security risk management is a continuous process, and it's an iterative process, right? So it means that if you have already conducted information security risk management previously, then you must have access to the reports and everything that points out the outcome of that. And that's why it's important that you have this details with you so that you can reuse it in order to establish the context. And you also need all the details about the stakeholders, the revenue of your business, the objective of your business, the different documents that are involved in it, the structure, the hierarchy in your organization, so that you can gather all this information while conducting the activity of context establishment. Okay, so as an output, the first thing that we should generate from this activity is the risk evaluation criteria. Risk evaluation criteria should be developed for evaluating the organization's information security risk, considering the following things. The first one is strategic value of business information process, the criticality of information assets that you have in your organization, and the importance of things like confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Okay, after that, we create the impact criteria, and it should be developed and specified in terms of the degree of damage or costs to the organization caused by a security incident. And we must consider the classification of impacted information asset while designing our impact criteria. We should also consider that the breach of confidentiality, integrity, or availability that can happen because of any security event, and how much impact it can create. Impact in terms of the loss of financial value, because maybe you can face some penalty, some charges, because you might yeah, you might get non-compliant to the law of regulation of your region or country because of some security incident. And you can also expect to lose your client, and because um, because some security incident leads to some serious damage in terms of maybe non-availability of the information or something, and that might breach the trust of your client, and they just decide to just shut down the business with you. Okay, so in this way there can be a serious damage in the reputation. So you must document all these things in the impact criteria, that will highlight that how much impact a security incident can create, okay, in terms of the degree of damage or cost. The third one is the risk acceptance criteria. Organization should define its own scales for levels of risk acceptance, business criteria, legal and regulatory aspects, operations, technology, finance, social and humanitarian factors. Everything should be considered while defining the risk acceptance criteria, and it may include multiple threshold. Okay, so to define the criteria of acceptance, so it's not like that we have just one threshold available where you can just decide that, okay, if something goes below this, we just accept it or reject it, or if it goes above, then we accept it. It's not very plain and simple. And it may be expressed as the ratio of estimated profit to the estimated risk, so that it can give a clear idea that if this ratio is high, then maybe we can accept the risk, otherwise we can reject it. And it can also apply to different classes or risk. Okay, for example, the any risk that can lead to non-compliance with regulations or law must not be accepted. Okay, so while creating this criteria, you have to bear these things in mind clearly, that there are certain things that you cannot violate or avoid at any cost. Okay, so those things must not be accepted, those risks must not be accepted. Okay, and after that, it's important that you define the scope and boundary of carrying out the risk management task. You cannot include everything in a single risk management activity. So, and that's perfectly fine, but you have to define that what are the things you are considering or taking into account, so that we can understand that at the end of risk management activity, how much we can rely on the outcome, and how much we can generalize the outcome. So scope ensures that all the relevant assets are taken into account, and boundaries are required to address those risks that might arise through these boundaries. So and the organization should consider the following information when defining the scope and boundaries. So for example, the organization should know about the functions and structure. It should have a very good idea about the legal, regulatory and contractual requirement. Okay, and it should know the details of the information assets, the location of organization, the expectation of stakeholders is also very important, um, because stakeholders, the major stakeholders play a very key role in your overall business goal. Okay, so it's important that you always keep that in mind when defining the scope and boundaries. Okay, so now when we carry out information security risk management activity in the organization, then we have to develop information security risk management process. Okay, which means that we have to identify and analyze our stakeholder who are going to be involved in this process throughout the whole activity. We have to define the role and responsibility of the internal and external stakeholders, parties that you think might be relevant for carrying out risk management. And you also need the specification of the records that you need in carrying out the task. The organization and responsibility for the information security risk management process should be set up and maintained throughout the whole process. Okay, now we just finished the first activity, that is the context establishment. And once we finished it, we have generated risk evaluation criteria, impact criteria, acceptance criteria, scope and boundaries, and role and responsibility of the organization. Now we are going to use all such outcome, all these information as an input to the second phase, that is the risk assessment phase. Risk assessment determines the value of information assets. It identifies the applicable threats and vulnerabilities that exist. It also identifies the existing controls and their effect on the risk identified, and it also determines the potential consequences, and finally prioritizes the derived risks and rank them against the risk evaluation criteria. Okay, so it means that this is a very crucial step in ISO 27005 framework, because this is the do phase. We just finished the planning phase. Now we are doing something to get a proper result. So here you can also see that I used three different colors here in the activity and in the output section also. So each color defines that how they are related to each other. It means that number 1 to 5 of the output is coming from risk identification, number 6 is coming from risk analysis, and number 7 is coming from risk evaluation. Okay, now we go to the first activity, sub activity of risk assessment, that is risk identification. Risk identification determine what could happen to cause a potential loss and to gain insight into how, where, and why the loss might happen. Okay, and typically it starts with identifying the asset in your organization. So asset is something that holds value. It has some important value, and these assets are required in order to do your everyday task and to finally also meet your business goal. An asset can be anything, so it can be information, it can be hardware, or it can be software. For example, desktop or computer machine can also be an important asset, because without having this in your company you cannot do your work, and that will not allow you to get the project done in time, right? So it's very critical to have your hardware in order. Similarly, software, maybe you if you are a company that deals with photography or something, then maybe Photoshop, having a Photoshop software is very important for you. Okay, it can be an asset, because without that you cannot work properly. And similarly, you can also think of, if you are a company that designs designs software for your client, then maybe the source code itself can be an asset, because without having an access to your source code, you cannot design your software. Once you identify your asset, it's also important that you identify the owner of each asset. Okay, so every asset has some owner, and the one who owns this asset, so you must figure that out, who are the owners of it. And Besides identifying the owner, you have to provide a value to your asset. You can agree on a scale while defining the value of the asset. You can go for the qualitative scale where you can just define like, okay, the value of this asset is very high or very low or medium or something. Or you can go for the quantitative scale where either you can have some scale like 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 based on the value, or you can also define the exact value in terms of like Norwegian kroner or American dollar or something. While defining the value of the asset, it's also important for certain asset that you also consider the value of replacing the asset. If something goes wrong, then maybe you have to either repair the asset or you have to completely replace it. So it is also a kind of value that that is held by the asset. Okay, so while defining this one, you have to clearly state that, okay, what does this value mean? Is it just the buying cost of the asset, or what does it signify? Once you are done with identifying the asset, you have to identify the potential threat. So anything that can cause harm to your asset is a threat, and threat can come from human source or non-human source. For example, a group of hacker can be a potential threat to your asset because they can hack your system or they can hack your source code or something. But when we deal with the human threat, then we have to understand the motivation, that what is something that motivates them to carry out such attack. And in case of non-human threat, we are more interested to know the origin of this threat. If it is accidental, so this A is accidental, D deliberate, or E environmental. So flood or maybe earthquake and those kind of threat is more like environmental origin. Okay, and for example, having a fire in your building and something like that, it can be more like an accidental uh, threat origin. And threat can affect more than one asset at any given time. So it's um, it's essential that you mm, you analyze your threat and asset properly so that you can understand that, okay, there can be a potential threat that can hamper more than one asset. After that, you identify the existing and planned control to avoid any duplication and extra work or cost. So it's a good idea that you identify the existing control and try to reuse it uh, by slight modification, because that will save your time and money also. So and in order to do that, you have to go through the result of audit, or maybe the you have to review the information security document to see what are the existing control. After that, we should identify the vulnerabilities that can exist inside the threat, because this vulnerability can be exploited by any possible threat. A vulnerability can be present in software, hardware, or the office personnel. So you have to you have to know about your asset properly so that you can decide or you can find the vulnerability. For example, in case of hardware, that is maybe computer, desktop, something, it can have a vulnerability if you are using and if we are using a very old version of operating system. For example, if you are using maybe Windows 98 in your server or some or Windows 7, then maybe the operating system is not patched with the current security updates. Okay, and that's why it is vulnerable to new threat or new virus or malware or ransomware or something that is arising every day. And once you identify your vulnerabilities, you should identify the consequence, that is the damage. Damage can caused by any incident scenario. And when you identify the consequences, you must take care of the repair time, the time that you lose in doing everything, the damage in the reputation, penalty, fine, or anything that can happen. Okay, so you have to identify all such things. Okay, so uh, now we finish the risk assessment phase, and once we finish it, we should have a clear idea, or we generate the list of asset, list of threat, list of vulnerability, list of existing control, list of consequences, all those things as an output uh, from this risk assessment phase. After that, we will go to the risk analysis phase. And risk analysis is a process to comprehend the nature of risk and determine the level of risk. And risk analysis deals with understanding the level of risk, right? And it says that risk is a combination of likelihood and consequence. So it's a likelihood of incident scenario and its consequence in terms of the damage. So it means that the threat how often threat can occur in your organization. So that's the likelihood, and what are the damage it can create. So uh, typically there are two major ways of measuring likelihood and consequence, and that is qualitative or quantitative. In case of qualitative, we just define it using like low, medium, or high in that way. And in case of quantitative, we use a scale, like let's say 0 to 5, 1 to 10, or so basically quantitative is more like a figure. We use numbers to define it. So for example, we can say that the likelihood of a particular incident scenario is very low, okay, in qualitative scale. And we can also define, and if we go for that, we have to define that what do we mean by low. So we can state that any incident scenario that happens 3 or 4 times in a year will be considered as low. Anything between 5 to 7 maybe medium, anything beyond 8 or 9 is high. Okay, so in your project report also you have to clearly mention that what do you mean by low, medium, or high if you are going for the qualitative. And similarly, if you are going for the quantitative, you have to also define that what is the significance of each number. And in a practical world, people usually start with the qualitative scale, where they just write low, medium, high in the first iteration, and in the second or third iteration, they replace this qualitative with quantitative. I mean, when they have the good idea about the exact figures, numbers, they just replace it with that. So once you finish this risk analysis phase, you get a list of risks with value level assigned to it. Now comes the risk evaluation. So the levels of risk should be compared against the risk evaluation criteria and risk acceptance criteria in this. So it uses the understanding of risk obtained from risk analysis phase, that is the previous phase, to make decision about the future action. So in the risk analysis phase, you get a list of risks with the value level assigned, maybe in qualitative or quantitative terms. So you can imagine that at the end of risk analysis, you have a table where you have, for example, 10 risk scenario, and you have certain value assigned to it. But now in risk evaluation, it is important that we assess this risk and we prioritize it. So and the whole idea of prioritizing is that we we should have a clear idea that which are the most critical risk for our system, for our organization, and we should treat them uh, by giving the high priority, right? So this is the main idea of the risk evaluation phase. So once, so that was the end of risk assessment phase. And when, if you are satisfied with the outcome of your risk assessment phase, then only you go for the risk treatment. In the risk treatment phase, we select controls to reduce, retain, or avoid or share risks, and define a risk treatment plan. So in this activity of risk treatment, we take all the list of risk prioritized according to risk evaluation criteria that we generated in the last phase just now. We feed this as an input to this activity, and after that we generate a risk treatment plan. We generate the residual risk once we apply the risk treatment option to this, and we also generate some contractual agreement if we require to do that. Okay, so risk treatment plans should describe how assessed risks are to be treated to meet the risk acceptance criteria. And here we can see that this diagram, it says the same thing, that you are satisfied with the risk assessment, then only you go for the risk treatment. And there are four major options available: risk modification, risk retention, risk avoidance, and risk sharing. The Once you apply any of this, or maybe more than one risk option, because they are not mutually exclusive, you can go for one or more than one options at the same time. But it's important that you always consider the cost versus benefit analysis while applying this risk treatment option. When a large reduction in risk may be obtained with relatively low expenditure, such options should be implemented. Okay, and it's also important that you perceive that how a given risk is affected, how a given risk can affect the parties involved in your organization. So that's why it's important that you communicate to your concerned parties that okay, we are thinking of applying this risk treatment options to this particular risk, and we expect to have the residual risk, residual risk. So in this way you can make the final decision. Okay, so the first option is called risk modification. In case of risk modification, risk is managed by introducing, removing, or altering controls so that the residual risk is acceptable. The whole idea of conducting risk treatment phase is that you can select a proper risk treatment option so that you can minimize the present risk, so that the residual risk that will be available after treating the risk with the risk treatment option, it will be accepted according to the risk acceptance criteria. So that's why in the risk modification we proactively alter or remove or introduce a new control so that the residual risk is accepted. In the risk retention option, risk is usually retained without any further action. It means that the risk that is available, it already meets the risk acceptance criteria. Okay, so we don't need to do anything in terms of defining or altering the control. We can just accept it. We go for the risk avoidance when the risk is too high, or and the cost of treatment options exceeds the benefit. Okay, so it means that even if we apply modification, sharing, or anything, then we are still exposed to the high amount of risk. In that case, we just try to avoid that risk. For example, if you are if you think that opening a new office in an earthquake or flood prone area can hamper your asset or your office completely, and there is no other way of dealing with this risk. Okay, so in that case you just avoid, you will decide that you are not going to open that office in that region, because it's this risk is very critical for you and you don't have any available option to deal with it. So in the best scenario, you will try to avoid this scenario completely. In the okay, so in the classical example of risk sharing is that we usually share the impact with an insurance company, so we can have some contractual agreement with the third party, most likely an insurance company, so that if any impact happens, any incident, any security incident happens, the impact will be shared. But it's important that you keep in mind that liabilities are not shared in this scenario phase. Okay, so maybe the damage in the reputation, and if you are liable to give any fine or penalty or something, then you have to face it. Okay, so now if we are satisfied with the risk treatment option and you find that you successfully apply one or more risk treatment options to the risk available, and the residual risk can be accepted based on the risk acceptance criteria, then we go for the risk acceptance. So in the risk acceptance criteria, it might be more complicated than simple checking if it is below or above the threshold value, because in this phase uh, we we take the output of the risk assessment phase, that is the list of risk prioritized according to the risk evaluation criteria. Then we apply the risk treatment, and then we generate the risk treatment plan where we have the details of the options and the residual risk and everything. And so that's why in risk acceptance, the concerned members finally decide that if they are going to accept the risk or reject it based on all the information that is available to them. So in this phase, we need the details of the risk acceptance criteria, risk treatment plan, and the residual risk, right? So that we can perform this activity, and at the end of this activity we have to produce a list of accepted risk with justification. So it's important that we justify that why we can accept this risk, even if you think that okay, it's a very trivial thing, but it's important that you document and you write it clearly so that it can be reused again in the next phase. Okay, so all risk information from the risk management activities should be exchanged and or shared between the decision maker and other stakeholders. So the risk communication phase deals with having all the necessary information that you produce in different activities as an outcome, and then you and after that you also have to write the performance reporting document, or you have to write the details of everything that is being produced. Okay, and it should be shared between the decision maker and other stakeholders. And it is in the practical scenario, in the practical world, we can always expect that new asset can be added to your organization, or maybe the existing asset can change their value with the change in the business goal, or maybe by introducing some new small companies in the organization or something, right? So we can always we have to be always active in perceiving the changes in the asset values, or maybe any change in the existing vulnerability, or maybe introduction of new vulnerability. So it's important that you always monitor your risk management task, and you always review it. Okay, so you have to see that how does the scope of your risk management change, and if there's any change in the asset or any control or anything. Okay, and if you perceive any changes, then you have to properly note it down, and then you also need to produce the workaround plan, or maybe the status report that will point out that how we can include these changes in the ongoing risk management process. And we know that risks are not static, so that's why it must be monitored and reviewed. So this was all about the major activities that are involved in ISO 27005, and I hope that this diagram will help you to find out the important information that you need to carry out each activity. Okay, and at the end of the risk management process, it's important that you just tally with this diagram that you have conducted all the mentioned steps properly. Okay, and as I said that risk management is a continuous process, so you must keep on doing. Okay, and if it is required, then you can go for more than one iteration to get the best outcome. So I will also encourage you to read um, the standard document of ISO 27005 2011, and you can get that in Yovik Bibliothek. I mean Ntnu Yovik Bibliothek, and I don't know the number of copies that are available there, but it's good that I mean it will be very helpful if you can go through it. There's also a link of the website present here, and you can find many interesting definition and terms related to ISO 27001 and ISO 27005 over there. I also mentioned a reference to my paper on ISO 27005, where I created an ontology to understand the relationship between different terms and concepts associated with ISO 27005 risk management standard. It's an I'll say that it's optional to read this paper, but if you really feel motivated and if you want to understand the relations among the different terms that are being mentioned in this lecture, then I'll recommend you to read this paper also. So that was all about my lecture, and I also added risk matrix here. You can utilize this risk matrix in the risk analysis phase, where you have to create a table of likelihood and the consequence of any incident scenario. Okay, so you can go for this simple table, or you can go for this more detailed table where you define the consequence in a very detailed manner, and you similarly you also define the likelihood, and then you provide the value to your risk. Okay, in this way we can understand that okay, the what are the different levels of risk that you consider in your scenario. I hope that this lecture will be useful to you in your while understanding the framework and while doing your project. Okay, so all the best for your project, and see you on 1st of February on Thursday.